Welcome to the Free Speech Hour. I'm your host, Charlie Dice. This is the show where free speech makes Welcome to the Free Speech Hour. I'm Charlie Dice, your host, and as always, we are the show of free speech, fresh perspectives, and fried fish on this first Friday in Lent. Today, it's a gloomy, rainy day in Berkeley, but we're sending our thoughts and our prayers to the people of Texas, who certainly have it much worse than we do. The power outages and food and water shortages are yet another sign that this 70-year period of comfort and stability that we've had in the West may actually be coming to an end. The great moderation of the 70s through the 2000s has given way to the Great Reset, and there's this confusion as to what or who is to blame for the continuous crisis unfolding before our eyes. Some will surely blame climate change and argue that this shows the need to transition to smarter grids with more central planning and renewable energy, less crude oil. Others are saying that renewable energy is, in fact, the primary reason behind Texas's blackouts, since the wind turbines that they've increasingly relied on for power shut off when the winds got too strong. Now consider this for a minute. The wind turbines can't operate when it gets too windy. I don't know about you, but that seems like a design flaw to me. I know that some will say that this is necessary, since with intermittent storage, you have kind of a problem of the mismatch, the temporal mismatch between when the energy is produced and when it's needs to be used. So some people will propose that we need more transmission lines, more central planning, more expensive storage solutions like pumped hydro dams, and mega infrastructure to solve this intertemporal mismatch. But I would say that these storms should be the time when we're generating the most energy and storing it for later. I know that in sailing, as wind speed goes up, the force goes up exponentially. So I think that we need to, if we're going to be making a transition to renewable energy, consider that we might be able to harness extreme weather events. Now, this might sound crazy, but hear me out for a second. I've been working on a concept for algae biofuel that's intended to be primarily wind powered, and it's an offshore application that would use the energy when it's available to power a energy intensive process of fuel conversion. The process of biofuel conversion tends to be uneconomical because the inputs, the amount of energy that you put into it, are greater than the amount of energy that you get out of it. So with a combination of an algae biofuel process at the heart of a wind-driven process, you can overcome this mismatch by creating an energy-dense form of storage that is fuel, which is just about as energy-dense as any storage medium can get, with this intermittent source of wind. And I think that this sort of anti-fragility is one of the missing components to our thinking about economic systems. And I hope that we can move towards a more resilient economy, especially as it comes to food supplies and water supplies. That's been another really troubling aspect of this experience in Texas, is that they're running out of drinking water in some places, and the store shelves are empty. I know that we get a lot of our meat from Texas, the cattle ranchers and places like that. So it's a real concern of mine as an obligate carnivore, that we find ways to make our food supply more resilient, and especially our meat supply. Representative Thomas Massie from Kentucky proposed a bill last year. Actually, it was first introduced several years ago, but he reissued this warning about the fragility of our food supply last year in talking about how the centralized meat packing plants are vulnerable to things like COVID coming along. And even if a small percentage of the supply gets knocked out, it can cause these much wider disruptions. And the same thing is happening in Texas, where even though only about 20 or 30% of their power, could be up to a third actually from the statistics that I've read, is this fragile wind power that shuts off during the windstorm. What happens is that if you don't have enough of a buffer, you have to shut off large swaths of the grid. So there's some confusion as to what's actually to blame. Everyone's trying to point the finger, and I think we all need to take a step back, stop pointing the finger, and look at what we can do to make our own personal economies more resilient, and encourage policymakers to look at alternatives to just these cut and dry, either Green New Deal or endless use of fossil fuels and crude oil. There are potentially ways, middle paths, as it were. So this morning, I want to bring on a recurring guest who is a part of the Free Speech Network and has launched his own show that just began this week. Ron Jones is joining me once again from Santa Clarita in Los Angeles, and we are going to be talking about a few different subjects, but I want to just start off, get Ron's thoughts on this blackout going on in Texas. Ron, welcome to the show this morning.
Well, I've been talking about leaving California, but I'm glad I'm not in Texas this week, because that is cold, man. I do pretty well in high heat. Like, I can go out in Death Valley and, be in 130 degrees, but that kind of cold, I don't know. I probably wouldn't make it. But it's very interesting. I think one of the things to think about is, you mentioned in your opening monologue about this addiction to comfort that we have developed over the last few decades since World War II. And the reality is that you don't really need that much food from a survival standpoint, and let's just talk like a few days to a couple weeks, if we're just looking at a temporary period in a acute crisis. You're not going to die if you don't have food for a day, unless you have some kind of extreme medical condition, But in our minds, we think that we have to have instant access to all these things. A little bit of water and a little bit of heat, so you don't freeze to death, and you could probably be okay. Don't panic. That's just, there hasn't been an abundance of food throughout human development always available. So we are designed to go through these periods of leanness, if you will, where we don't have a lot of supply. So that's just something that came to mind. I know I've been making a few more efforts here to have some supplies on hand, because we live in an earthquake area, of course, in California. Whether it's extra food you can get at Costco, or canned pork and beans, or the official emergency food in the buckets that last 25 years. I mean, there are a lot of different ways to do it so you can get through a few days.
Just before COVID hit, before there was really any panic or people going to the grocery store to stock up on toilet paper, I had found a great deal on Wild Planet sardines and stocked up. I bought about 6 pallets. Each pallet was about 12 cans. And I've just gotten down to the bottom of my supply here about a year later. And I restocked on an off-brand. Wild Planet's my favorite because they're sort of sustainably harvested, and they just taste better. They're high quality, and they're in water, not canola oil, like a lot of these canned fish are. And people who know about my vendetta against seed oils are probably rolling their eyes right now. I caused a little bit of a kerfuffle on Facebook this week for noting that the head lube on my boat, which is a little product that West Marine sells to loosen the tubes of the toilet plumbing on the boat, is made from canola oil. And I just noted this saying, is this really something that we want to be cooking with and eating? And people pointed out that it is a little bit of a logical fallacy to suggest that just because something can be used as head lube or paint thinner as it's been used in the past, but I digress. So yeah, the idea of the kind of the scarcity mindset that can creep in when we go without food for any period of time. This has been on my mind lately with the beginning of the season of Lent. And there's a little bit of a paradox for people who are observing the fasting requirements or the fasting rules of Lent, which is that in the Bible, we're told not to tell people when we're fasting, but instead to do it as an interior fast and to do it joyfully, not showing other people that you're fasting by acting miserable and contorting your face. But I think that in modern times, there's been a real decline in this as a spiritual discipline. I know in the Catholic Church, it's gone from something that in the early centuries, people observed the 40 days of Lent very severely and would give up not just meat, but also dairy and eggs and oils. The Eastern Orthodox continue this fast today, at least the observant ones. And so I think that, I'm trying to bring back a little bit of fasting discipline in my own life and not trying to acquire some sort of merit from it, but hoping that maybe other people will recognize that we've lost this discipline. And so I will mention, and I put in the notes to this conversation, that my 40-day course on spiritual fasting for modern times began this week, but the real meat of it, no pun intended, begins on Monday, where I'll be offering more strategies for modern people who might not be accustomed to fasting to ease into it, starting off with just overnight fast, 12-hour fast, and 3 meals a day with no snacking, moving towards skipping a meal, maybe skipping breakfast, maybe even skipping breakfast and lunch, seeing if you can make it to dinner. And this was another practice, the kind of fasting from sunset to sunset that you can date back to ancient Jewish practice, and it was picked up and carried on by Christians in the last 2,000 years. But in the last 200 years or so, we've really seen it fall off the map. Have you done much fasting in your own practice?
I've tried it, and I do agree that there's a lack of spirituality in fasting or nutrition in general. I did corporate wellness for about 15 years to work with so many people on eating, and that was the toughest thing. I mean, I've done a lot of different things in health and PE and fitness. The hardest thing I've ever done is to coach people on eating behaviors. People will hang on to their behaviors, eating. I mean, they'll do a lot of other things, but it's really difficult for people to change how they eat. But I remember people that would go on a fast, and they would kind of advertise it, and it would go on 1 day or 2 or 3, and then they would immediately go to the fast food place and just completely pig out on hamburgers and French fries and all this stuff. And it just never made much sense to me. I'm also a very practical person with common sense. So if you look back at the history of human development, it seems rather rational to understand that there hasn't always been a constant food supply. So it would appear that, we have developed for thousands of years with the ability not to have food for certain periods of time. And so to go for a day or two without food makes complete sense. If you think about somebody out there in the wilderness, you might not see a bear running by for a few days, or there might not be any fish where you're at. It's amazing what people have sustained themselves on or done without. But, with all the modernization of food supply, and we just kind of take that for granted. I used to teach with a guy that was a Zen practitioner. And one of the things, I learned from him is just to be appreciative of your food. And I don't always do that, but it's nice to at least look down. And his way of thinking about it was to appreciate all the different hands that were involved in bringing you that food, from the farmers to the truck drivers to the processors to the people in the grocery store. And if you think about it, it's really it's a very tribal or community exercise. There are so many different people involved with that. And even if you're growing your own food in the backyard, you still have to have initially some tools to work the soil and seeds and things like this. So I think in today we've lost a lot of our gratefulness in in general, for food and a lot of other things. And the opportunity with all this crisis is to get back to some basics. Like, you know, if you think about, wow, it'd be really nice just to go to the bar and have a beer with my buddies, you know, and we lost those simple things. And I hope people, if when we get back to more of a normal type of living, that people don't forget what we've been through.
If when it's kind of ominous, and I was
Yeah.
having a conversation with a couple of guys last night where I had to admit that I've been a little bit strident on this issue, and I recognize where people are coming from with valid considerations about COVID. It's really hard, I think, to see the full picture, to see all of the costs, all of the benefits at once. We can zoom in on one aspect or another, whether it's seniors who are at risk or children who are at risk of not socializing effectively. Your podcast is going to deal with this issue of the increase in teenage suicides, which we won't be able to measure the full impact of that maybe for years to come. And there are all these little things, from people that are missing out on their 12-step meetings and the relapses and domestic abuse, all these things that are intangible and don't show up in the immediate mortality statistics when you're counting every single death from COVID. And I don't want to beat a dead horse with this, but I do think right now I'm kind of considering this fast and this Lenten season as hopefully a preparation for a change that will come in the spring. And that change, I think, ultimately has to come from the bottom up. It has to be people who are deciding to go back and live their lives, not just normally, but let's actually strive for an even richer community life, even richer outdoor activities if people are uncomfortable going back to large indoor gatherings. And so the period of Lent, it actually means the lengthening of days. Lent is maybe a Latin word that refers to this lengthening of days. And as we get out of the winter and into the spring, I think people need to really start to take responsibility for their health, learn about vitamin D deficiency, learn about metabolic syndrome. And if you're doing the right things in those areas, then I think if we try to look at the big picture, we find that we need to get back to living in community with one another, and that the benefits of that will outweigh whatever risks there are, including to some of the more vulnerable people. I could be wrong about that, but I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Oh, I agree. There's no, I don't think we should underestimate the value of human to human personal interaction. And one of my areas of research, Charlie, is on the post-industrial era, where it was a national conversation in the United States, especially, that there was a grave concern in the 1920s, 1930s about the machine, and the machine creating extra time, and the machine devaluing the craftsmanship of the workplace. So you go from a true craftsman to just being an assembly line worker and things of that nature. So there's this caution about 100 years ago sent out to us today to be careful of the machine. And I'm very, very concerned, as I look around as a history person, that we've done the exact opposite of last year. We've just, the machine is a holy grail. It's remote learning, it's remote working. And I mean, one of the things I discussed on my show today was a BBC article that just came out about the high prevalence for people to work from bed all day. Like, throughout this whole thing, even though I've been working from home, I never spent one day working in bed, ever. I always got up. I went to the porch, I went to my office, I went out in the backyard, I went to the garage. I mean, I'm moving about, but if if you're not raised in a physical culture and you're never given proper physical education, how would you even know the importance of health and physical literacy? So it's like, it's kind of a no-brainer. I'll just stay in bed because it doesn't matter. Well, it does matter. Now I've got my PE hat on here. I'm just like losing the rest of my hair over this conversation the last year, because people don't understand how critical it is to be physically fit for mental stability. You know, one of the things that I lost this last year in terms of the loss of social interaction, how it affected my mental health, is I trained in a martial arts group every Sunday down in Venice with these guys that had been teaching and doing martial arts for like 40 plus years, some of them. And I mean, the I mean, fifth level black belt people, right? And I'm the beginner in the group. Like, I'm honestly like the complete novice, right? But I got
What discipline is that? Are they practicing
oh,
a particular kind of martial arts?
yeah, they were JKD people, so it was mixed martial arts. I mean, a lot of them came out of the Ensanto Academy. Um,
Not familiar.
the Ensanto Academy, Dan Ensanto is considered basically the highest level martial artist in the world. He was Bruce Lee's, main training partner, and he's got a facility down in West LA that people come from all over the world to attend his seminars and workshops and things like this. So these guys went through that type of thing in the 70s, and then they went on to teach and practice, and they're super high level. But I got so much out of this beyond just self-defense. There was it was a group of men getting together, socializing. We would go out to lunch sometimes after class, spend a couple hours in training. It was just such a wonderful thing, and we've all just really missed that. And this is just like one example of the suffering. I mean, every Sunday it was a routine for me. Every Sunday, almost without fail, I would drive down to Venice and participate in that. And I've continued to train on my own, but it's not the same. I had a PE teacher write me this morning. Well, he's got his students doing the La Sierra calisthenics, but I explained to him, like, that's great from a mechanical standpoint, but the La Sierra PE system was based on team group interaction. So you're all working together with the calisthenics, and it's the magic of it was working as a group, as a team. And now
there's something lost in the body language component here too.
Yeah.
Don't you think?
Yes. Yeah. So anyway, I went into some of this on my show today because I talked about, the BBC article on working from bed. And I made the point that if you're not teaching kids physical literacy, because the show was about school cancellations and sport programs being cut out, then you're looking at a generation of kids growing up that don't know the difference. They don't know why they should move in the first place. That is the end. Like there is no future at that point, not any kind of future that a rational person will want to experience. So we're really in a crisis point, and I know I keep barking about this, but history has so many warnings. We've got to do something, and it has to be now. It has to be now.
People can find your show on the Free Speech Network. The website for that is dowehavefreespeech.com. And there will be the long road, right? That's you've settled on for the name of the show, right?
Yes, the long road. And I went into that, like how I got the name and where that came from, and related it back to the Eric Hoffer article on college kids. But I really enjoy the format, and I want to thank you for helping me set it up, because I get to talk about things that aren't related to PE and fitness, because quite frankly, it's a little depressing at times to me. Like it's so overwhelming when you know what I know, and you have all this research, surrounds me. It's overwhelming, and it's really been uplifting for me to be able to talk about philosophy and literature and just, get some different ideas turning in my head. And I think that'll make me a better physical educator, is to diversify a little bit more, which is one of the things I learned studying all these PE greats, is they were Renaissance men and women. They weren't just PE teachers. They were artists and photographers and sculptors and poets and writers and travelers. And, they were well-rounded, and they read on all kinds of topics, not just biomechanics or metabolic, issues. So
let's shift gears for just a couple minutes and talk about the momentous passing of a radio giant, Rush Limbaugh. Whether you love him or you hate him, you have to recognize that the man was extremely influential. He came about, really kind of rose to fame starting in the 80s, started off in Sacramento, California, before moving to New York City, And from there, he was launched to the national spotlight as a syndicated host all across the country and became the center of a talk radio lineup. If people aren't or have never listened to AM radio before, which a lot of people never have, they might not realize that there's a large swath of the country that's listening to this every day, either in their car or the mechanics at their auto shop that just have the radio on all day, and they get into a certain stream, a certain rhythm, hearing the narratives from these larger than life personalities, people like Rush Limbaugh. Now, do you recall when you first heard of Rush Limbaugh, or when he first came on your radar screen?
Oh, it was in the 80s because I was working construction. So I used to listen to his show in my truck, my
There
work
you
truck.
go.
And
Yeah.
and
What
so
were your
I
recollections?
yeah, I was listening to him from the get-go early. And then I went back to college and I got more liberal in my thinking and I got away from it. And, there are a lot of things that he said that I didn't agree with, that I thought were too extreme or he crossed the line on. But I think, to your point, when you have a man or woman or person that dedicates themselves to the craft, to the profession for that long and puts that much effort into something, you have to respect the work. And this is where you need to be a larger human and pull yourself back away from the politics a bit. I know, and I'm gonna do a show on Rush as well, because I saw some real vitriol about his death and passing. I just thought it was very inappropriate from a decorum standpoint. And I think this is one of the things that must change. Otherwise, we're literally going to eat ourselves alive here. We have to have the ability to have disagreements and even arguments. Ginsburg just passed away, and she had a relationship with Scalia, and they were at the opposite ends of the political spectrum and ideology, and yet they were very, very good friends and did all kinds of things together socially. And so I think that's a great example. Eric Hoffer, his best friend, was a far left-wing socialist, and he got into an argument with the guy in his deathbed, and it kind of woke him up and revitalized him the last few weeks. So I think that's what we need, not to just cancel everybody because you don't like them and just say these awful things about them. So
Nor
that's my
paper
thoughts.
over our real differences if they are there. And so, we don't need to just come together on a lukewarm middle ground. We can have disagreements and we can duke it out in certain arenas and still come away from it without hating the other person or thinking that they need to be expelled from polite society.
I think back at the old pub thing, like in the UK or Scotland, where, and I'll just say, I don't know what the women did, but on the male side, they would go to the pub and they would have their arguments. And sometimes I read that they would even go outside and like duke it out. And then they come back in and have a nightcap, and then they go home and they do it again the next day. We're missing these opportunities for almost like roughhousing a little bit, roughhousing and just getting over it and working our stuff out, and being okay with that, being okay to be different. There is no diversity without differences. People cry and talk and scream and yell about diversity, and then they want everything equal. Well, it doesn't work that way. If you want diversity, you have to have differences, and you have to appreciate the differences, or at least acknowledge them, without trying to beat somebody down. So, he was also an entertainer. That's what people tend to forget. It wasn't just a news show or a political commentary. He was an entertainer. And when you're an entertainer, you push edges and boundaries and things like that. And sometimes you go too far, but he 3 hours a day, 5 days a week for 30 plus years. I mean, it's an amazing body of work. So on that end of it, I do respect the work that he did. I think he was a loyal American. I think he cared about people. And I think he wanted the best for the country. So
it set a high bar for those of us who are trying to break into the radio industry or have a presence. And I think that no one will come and just replace Rush overnight. There are some people. There are another actually relative giant in radio, Michael Savage, recently retired, so he's not going to step in to fill his shoes. People like Sean Hannity, I think, don't quite tap into the the zeitgeist in the same way that Rush Limbaugh did. There's a little bit more of this sort of rah-rah cheerleading for the Republican side on Sean Hannity, where I always got the sense that Rush Limbaugh was thinking for himself. And even if he was, dyed in the wool conservative Republican, he always had ways to sort of surprise you with what his take on issues were. He wasn't just it wasn't another talking head. And I want to note some of his numbers, the ratings that he got consistently on the order of 16 million listeners a week. And you compare that to the top cable ratings, 10 million a month maximum. So people who might not have listened to Rush Limbaugh themselves won't realize how much influence he had over the discourse, just by virtue of not being part of that world. And radio does have a way of going under the radar of more of the mainstream media. Today there's all this talk of censorship on social media, and of course, if you go to CNN or MSNBC, you're pretty much going to get the same story. Increasingly, even Fox News is going to tell you some variation of the same story. Radio is one of those few places where you can really break out with a different narrative. And there's a whole sordid history of how talk radio was actually censored for a large swath of the 20th century. We talked about that a little bit on the demo of the show with the Fairness Doctrine, and John F. Kennedy. One of his dark marks was that he went after his political opponents on talk radio who were chastising him for his unpopular policy positions. But a large number of Americans never even knew about some of these things because they weren't being reported on by the nightly news, which at that time was the ascendant form of media. And so he went after them with this FCC regulation called the Fairness Doctrine that basically required radio stations to give equal airtime to opposing viewpoints. So if you had 3 hours of Carl McIntyre, who was the equivalent of Rush Limbaugh back then, you would have to offer 3 hours to someone offering a rebuttal. And part of that requirement was also that if the rebuttal, the respondent said that they couldn't pay for the time on the air, then you had to give it to them for free. So you can imagine not many of the respondents said that they could pay when it came time to offer the rebuttal. So it was basically a death sentence for all these talk radio stations. It almost killed right-wing radio. It really did smother it for several decades until Carter came along and started deregulating. People don't really realize that Carter was a deregulator, and then Reagan put the nail in the coffin, repealing the Fairness Doctrine at the end of his second term. But this is just a little chapter of history that we don't want to lose down the memory hole, because it actually has implications for the current discussion around social media. And my take is that we would be unwise to put restrictions on social media companies saying they have to publish this point of view or that point of view. Instead, we should take the lesson from the first half of the 20th century, where when we gave government the authority to say what private actors could and couldn't do on their platforms, they ended up, basically that silenced one side of the political spectrum. And I think that it could just as easily happen on social media. So we want to be wary of that, and hopefully radio will be around for a long time to come to continue to circumvent the would-be censors. And if not internet radio, then maybe we'll have to make a return to good old-fashioned medium wave AM radio.
Well, I've done AM radio and I've done FM radio too, and it's a live radio on the air is just a wonderful format. Although I am enjoying the new format here, and I've done podcasting for over 10 years now, so it's close, but it's not the same. There's nothing like a live audience. It's really, really fun, and taking live call-ins. But one thing people need to understand: there are a lot of conservative people out there. When you look at the numbers that Rush had for decades, those people are going to rise up eventually, and they're going to be heard. And just because you don't hear as much from them right now doesn't mean they're not out there. So that's something to consider. There are a lot of people out there that have a different way of thinking than Portland, so, or a certain neighborhood of Portland, and people have criticized me about criticizing Portland. Well, it's only happening in like a 3-block area. I was, okay, so that 3-block area, there are a lot of us that don't feel the same way as those people in the 3-block area of Portland. Let's say it that way.
Well said. And I think that the advice that sticks out to me from this conversation is just to get out into the world and talk to your neighbors. Talk to people who you might disagree with. Try to find avenues where you can explore challenging points of view that don't align with your pre-existing biases. And also, in getting out there, get outside and start to rebuild your own community. Starting outdoors as the weather starts to get nicer, it's a great opportunity to get that vitamin D, get that social interaction that's so crucial for our health and our immune system. And consider the big picture. Consider that we are not isolated, atomistic beings. We are social creatures that are designed to live in fellowship with one another, and that's essential for our life, our liberty, and our pursuit of happiness. This has been a abridged version. With the free speech hour is turning into the free speech half hour, because I would rather say what I feel needs to be said and leave it at that than stretch on for a full hour just to fill the airtime. But Ron, I want to thank you again for joining me this morning on short notice. And thanks for doing this experiment with me, starting your own show. And we're out here in the wild west of internet radio.
It is.
Yeehaw.
Yeehaw, man. It's going to get a little wilder, I think. So hang on.
Hang on
to your hats, hombre.
Hang on to your hats. And for those of you out there in Texas, hang tight, stay the course, as Ron would say, is closing for the long road. It is a long road indeed. And trust that, get your fresh water supplies, get your heat, your essentials, and maybe take this time to do a little intermittent fasting. It's
forced fasting.
It's very cleansing, and like Ron says, we can go actually quite a long time. Most of us have enough fat supplies on our body that we can go days, weeks. Some people can even go months just consuming their own body fat and really suffer no ill long-term consequences from that. Water, on the other hand, and sleep, those are going to be things that you need to get. So take care of yourselves, and we'll see you next time on the next edition of the Free Speech Hour, where free speech makes its